Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of ThreeTings. Hope everybody's well. Hope you've been enjoying this series thus far. So just to recap, we've started off 250 years ago speaking about the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We've then moved on to speak about the Napoleonic era and the Haitian Revolution, or the Polish involvement there. Also, now, before then, we've moved on to the First World War. Poland obviously achieved its independence via default because of obviously wanting to stabilise the region, and the Western powers saw fit for Poland to have back its statehood. Yeah, we're now post Second World War. Obviously, a lot of us know what happened there, so I saw fit just to not include too much about the in-between period. But we're now at the post-war stage that we're going to cover today. So what I'm going to do is give you a sort of an overview of what life may have been like for the citizen after the Second World War, which is post-1945, going up to around about 1980, whereby I'm going to give you a sort of analogy via the sports field, just of what these people would have been potentially going through, which is quite harrowing. Anyway, I hope this, I hope it's been received well thus far, and I'll start reading to you. Right, so good overcame the devil. Hitler's Nazi regime was toppled by Allied forces and suffered the undignified reversal of invasion the Wehrmacht had carried out against its martial adversaries, swiftly followed by the cultural medication of westernization, eventually culminating in partition following the erection of the Berlin Wall. The Eastern District, submerged in a lingering influence of Russification at the mercy of the worst artists of suppression in Europe as centralized administrators alongside the notorious Stasi at the helm of social justice. The Stasi were the East German secret police and state-sponsored to maintain a draconian order that caused the degradation of societal cohesion as they forged an environment where friends, family, work colleagues and neighbours were hypnotised into widespread deep-seated mistrust, where all were under investigative suspicion. The age of privacy invasion had its birthplace confirmed officially and truly originates the term surveillance state, with CCTV, phone taps and listening devices covertly planted against those suspected of spycraft or upsetting the order of things. The Stasi and the East German regime became famous for psychological experimental campaigns of torture that had them courted as the founding fathers of MK Ultra, that later made its way across the pond to the CIA and was used as a tool to quell civil disobedience and groups by targeting individuals that could evolve into challenging the order of state affairs that were not in congruency with the political agenda. The Poles, on the other hand, post-war, had to resign themselves to withdrawal symptoms of a government in tatters. In July 1944, an interim government took formation called the Polish Committee of National Liberation. Not to be outdone, the Ministry of Public Security, the UB, was banded together as a special task force that would protect and order the internal affairs that possessed the capacity to upset societal equilibrium. For roughly 10 years, the UB at the liberty of infested infiltration of Russian intelligence, where every governmental department would jokingly have every whispered word of transgression fed back to the superiors in Moscow. The occupiers had continued where they left off in continuum of the last few centuries. Thousands of state-sanctioned executions were carried out. The astonishing detail is that commitment of crime against country only had to be alleged. Regardless of age verification, the UB, in the name of societal righteousness, could lawfully execute minors. Polish resistance movements were hunted down by the thousands and were either eliminated or imprisoned to be distributed across the Gulag system, which meant being placed under chattel or forced labour camps, an extension of what the Nazi regime had patterned, or faced banishment to isolated locations in the ice dunes of Siberia to be sentenced to lifelong conditions unfit for polar bear inhabitation. So, post-Second World War, Poland enters a time of hardship still, just on recovery. That it's been spoken of, one of the worst wars you could ever see, or has been seen to date, you could say, was on their land. It turns into becoming, at this stage, a very, very repressive state. But not just there, also it was mirroring the same in Germany as well, which equally was bombarded with bombs and whatever else, and war, So it's very repressive times. Any type of resistance movements to what was going on at the time, on the side of fairness as well, I would say, had to be there, because just to settle the place down and stabilise the place and make sure that there was no sort of reoccurrence of war, or to just take the country into a new phase. So resistance groups were sort of hunted down in the thousands and either put into the Gulag system, or which was not far off a concentration camp, as far as we're concerned. And if not that, then obviously they could be executed, and you could execute even kids as well, which wasn't liked and wasn't wanted at all. And that's I never knew that. That is do you know what I mean? Even kids, it didn't matter. Anyone that was suspected of sabotage or coming up against the status quo, they were taken out in any way, shape or form. It didn't matter who you were. You had to all toe the line, And so it made for a very draconian and repressive state. The Committee for Public Safety, constructed as a shield of protection, had become the authoritarian iron hand of Moscow, controlling Poland from within. Finally disbanded in the mid-1950s, the Polish government needed fresh impetus. Under decision of the Polish Council of State and the Council of Ministers, public security, a split into two divisions of enforcement occurred. Firstly, in came the KDSBP, and secondly the MSW, or SB as it was abbreviated, became the secret service that transpired into the main authority of law and order, as well as state protectors. The organisation was allowed to dominate public security, nevertheless still would not have exercised the ghost shadows hosted by sleepers sitting dormant throughout the KGB's web that had the infrastructure capability of weaving its arms covered in suckers akin to octopus's intellectual reconnaissance of a coral reef from Vilnius in the east to Berlin in the west. Right up until the fall of communism in 1989, the SB were Poland's premier defence. So, that was a picture of just an overview of what was going on, who they were controlled by throughout this period, going from the post-war years up until sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, right? What I would say is a very repressive state. Not good that, and if you resisted, you were no more, you were put into the Gulag system, or dissidence was dealt with very, very harshly. Very, very repressive state, whilst on the other side now, on the capitalist side, and in West Germany as a comparison, they were flourishing. Economically, they were becoming an industrial powerhouse. They were able to sort of pretty much become a monopoly when it comes to automobile manufacturing in the world. We know all the big sort of car brands that have come out of Germany, still here to this day, still at the forefront. that would have been all the hard work done after the post-war, all the hard work that they were allowed to be afforded because they were under supervision from the world, but they were allowed to be part of the free economy, which obviously they took full advantage of. So, yeah, real tough period, you could say, for the proletariat. However, there'll be light. There'll be light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully for them, man. But at this stage, very, very tough place, and maybe somewhere you'd not want to be, and quite tough, quite ghetto, you could say. So officially, the last soldier to perish holding Second World War grievances was in the early 1960s. Poland, at the time, sat incarcerated under the Eastern Bloc as a vassal status meant they would have been depicted as a member of Russia's ever-reluctant harem of United States, with sovereignty placed under the auspices of totalitarian coercion. In a time of sweeping change underpinned by the uprising economic domination of capitalism, whose propaganda of free market enterprise, coupled with the citizens across the capitalist world being at least able to exercise freedom of speech without fear of reprisal, in conflation of having the freedom of democratic vote that for the first time in history unshackled blacks in America too glaringly close to West German citizens that without malice flaunted their newfound fortune, must have been a bitter pill to swallow. So, at this stage, you're moving into the 50s, 60s, there's a lot of freedom, speak of freedom, a lot of civil rights movements, especially going off in America. You're seeing like black people now get a vote in America. That would have been a breakthrough, not just for black people, but all over the world, of people that were seen as the underclasses stepping up against power, because America was the most powerful state. So for you to almost go up against America and now be able to vote within their country, that's something to attest to, right? Also, it was sort of clearly starting to show the difference between communism and capitalism. And capitalism was starting to move away. And also in the Western world, you were seeing yourself as free in terms of speech. You could demonstrate. You weren't sort of covertly put under surveillance as such, although it would have been there obviously for defence purposes. Basically, it was just looking like a free world. And that hence the term free market, free economy, free Western world, whatever, that word free, whatever it is it's often attached to the Western world. Other places it's not, but in this place they would have probably looked on from the other side of the Berlin Wall, going back to Poland, Lithuania, that we're living almost like slaves, but they're living a life of royalty, they're living free. So Poland by default being still administered and controlled by those in the Kremlin, and Russia and Moscow to an extent, right, were obviously now part of the Eastern Bloc. So they were actually now seen as a part of Russia or a part of the Soviet Union, and they were not a part of the Western world. So they would have been seen as a bit of a pariah, and they would have been isolated from the world and just looking on and seeing that, their fruits aren't, coming to the Uber. I mean, they're not doing well for themselves, So, the fate and fortune of the two national football teams afford a compelling reflection. East Germany seldom enjoyed relative success in comparison to the West German team. East Germany's first official game was away against Poland in 1952. The match ended in East German defeat as they were soundly drubbed 3-0 in front of a 35,000 ballistic Warsaw Legionnaire home crowd. Meanwhile, West Germany took major honours as they went on to lift the coveted Jules Rimet Trophy in 1954 and 1974 respectively. Although it must be mentioned, the only time East and West Germany officially met in competition was in 1974 in a post-qualified group stage game of minor relevance, which saw the West exercising its right to rest the lethal Karl-Heinz Rummenigge. The game was eventually settled by a solo effort from Jürgen Sparwasser, as the role of minnows, the East's celebration was that of slaying a giant. However, it was the West that would roll on and be crowned champions from the sporting perspective, as well as the unforgiving societal field, which was the cause of brotherly envy off pitch that had one side of the wall peering into the pitch black abyss, whilst the other basked in the global warming capitalist sun. So quite clearly, art imitated life. You had East Germany, pretty much minnows, never achieved nothing on the international scene. You've got West Germany, who are literally, they're seen like Brazil, or Brazil's probably the most successful football team ever. I think Germany's pretty much equal with them. So you could say, like, do you know what I mean? In terms of, like, on the football pitch, they're like the best ever team or the best ever nation that's ever played football. Yeah, they can say that. Yeah, and the East was languishing. They weren't like a big team at all, and so you can see, like, even on the football pitch, you could see the difference, and that's what was going on. Like, the West was basking in, like, the global warming capitalist sun, because obviously they were industrializing themselves at the time, and they were, like, economically becoming a giant once again, whilst the East was suffering and not achieving much. Were like just like going down the drain, basically. As I've read, like, I've been going back a couple of years, right? So it just showed, like, even on the sporting field, it didn't escape what was going on socially, and even still, like, they would have been envious of the sports teams, let alone political or socially, So Poland, by default as well, they're still a part of this, because, like, East Germany, Poland, they were pretty much being controlled by the same regime centrally, And so, yeah, just a good analogy for people to sort of take back with them, to take home with themselves, But anyway, that brings this episode of Three Things to an end. Just in conclusion, once again, post-war, a really, really hard place to live. Very, very strict. Had to be, but at the same time, pretty much inhumane place, and was probably better you leaving to go somewhere else, rather than sticking around and being controlled or being under this regime. You'd have much rather be somewhere else, I would say. I would suffice, But they got through it, but then what was to come next was a war of words, and just like sort of a soft war, you might want to call it, but it was still teetering on the brink, because the Americans, they had weapons sort of circling Russia to the south, and you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so the world was jittery going through the 60s and 70s and 80s, thinking one little thing could avalanche and it could go off between the two biggest powers, and everyone in between would be maybe used as a proxy, so it wasn't good. It was like thinking it could be world ending, especially because of what's happened 20-30 years before, the natural people would have been worried, but through these times it was terrifically difficult, and you couldn't stand out in any way, shape or form, because if you did, dissidents were handled like, not like today's world, they were like literally taken out, But anyway, that brings this episode to a conclusion. I hope you've enjoyed it. Yeah, I enjoyed it, and I hope this message reaches you well. Anyway, take care, God bless, love, one.